Hey guys, my name's Chris Donasso. Welcome to the Truth Tank, where we love to explore truth, reality, and reason. There is no question that Jesus Christ is one of the most important, influential, talked about, controversial, debated about figures in all of human history. And there's a really good reason for that. And the reason is this. If the claims that Jesus made and the extraordinary life that he lived is true, then there are some very weighty implications that has for both you and me and every human being. And so what you believe about Jesus is one of the most important things you could ever think about. So what are the claims that Jesus made? Well, for one, he claimed to be the Son of God, the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. He said things like, I and the Father are one, and if you've seen me, you've also seen the Father, and if you've known me, you've known the Father. In fact, the religious leaders at the time weren't happy about that. They wanted to kill him because he, quote, made himself equal to God. And so Jesus made some pretty extraordinary claims. In fact, no other religious leader has made the claims that Jesus has made. Not Buddha, not Muhammad, nobody. And so this kind of puts Jesus in a category all of his own. Now, anyone can make a claim. That doesn't make it necessarily true. But what's so compelling about the life of Jesus is that not only did he make claims, but his claims were also accompanied by supernatural events, unexplainable events. Think of it like this. If someone ran up to you in the middle of the street while you were walking to work and said, the world's going to end on June 1st, 2020, and then they ran off. Well, you'd probably laugh, you'd probably roll your eyes, you probably would think they were kind of a nutcase. But if that same person came up to you and said, the world's going to end on June 1st, 2020, and then they began to glow like an angelic being, and then they slowly faded away until poof, they vanished. Well, now, not only did they make a claim, but their claim was accompanied by an unexplainable or supernatural event. So you're going to be more inclined to take their words a little more seriously because of that. And so that's kind of how the life of Jesus was. Not only did he make claims, but he also did miracles. Well, today's going to be part one of a series that I'm going to do. I'm not sure how long it is just because there's so much content on this particular topic. But we're going to talk about one miracle, and this is the miracle of all miracles. In fact, Christianity stands or falls on this particular miracle. And of course, I'm talking about the resurrection. Even the Apostle Paul said that if the resurrection didn't happen, then my preaching and your faith are in vain, and we're to be pitied above all men. But if it did happen, if the resurrection did happen, it's kind of like an iron safe where all of the truths of Christianity, all the promises of God, all the stories are contained, safe, protected, and untouchable. Well, come on, Chris, what about Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark and talking snakes and these kind of stories that seem so crazy in the Bible? Well, Jesus actually referred to those particular stories. And so if Jesus was who he said he was, if he did the things he said he did, if he really rose from the dead, then I think we could believe that he's right about those stories too. So before we talk about some of the evidence for the resurrection, I do want to talk about a couple common objectives that I hear, and one is just that Jesus never lived, that he's not a historical figure, kind of on the par of someone like Hercules or something like that. I've heard that in talking with other people, maybe you have. Another one that I often hear that's common is just that Jesus never really died, that maybe he went to the cross, but he was resuscitated, or he never really died, and that's how you explain the empty tomb. Let me tell you this, two facts that you can definitely take to the bank are one, Jesus lived, and two, Jesus died on a Roman cross. So those other ideas that he didn't, you can file those away in the ridiculous folder, because there is absolutely no scholarly evidence that that's true whatsoever. No critical thinker on the resurrection believes that that's true. For example, there's a New Testament scholar by the name of Bart Ehrman. In fact, Bart is an agnostic leaning towards atheist. He's one of the most respected New Testament scholars of our day. When he was questioned about the existence of Jesus, he said this. And remember, this is one of the best top New Testament scholars, who's not a Christian, by the way. He says, quote, "There's no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed." He also says on the crucifixion of Jesus, "The denial that Christ was crucified is like the denial of the Holocaust. For some, it's simply too horrific to affirm. For others, it's an elaborate conspiracy to coerce religious sympathy. But the deniers live in a historical dream world." End of quote. We also have the German New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann. He says, "The fact of the death of Jesus as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable, despite hypotheses of a pseudo-death or a deception which are sometimes put forward. It need not be discussed further here." There's also John Dominic Crossan, who is the founder of the Jesus Seminar, a very liberal organization. Even he says, quote, "Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be." So why is this important? Well, we're talking today about the resurrection. So if Jesus didn't live and Jesus didn't die, we can't have a resurrected Jesus. All right, so I want to just give you some, what I'm going to call common sense evidence for the resurrection. First of all, we have numerous eyewitnesses. If we take the traditional authorship given to us by the early church of the Gospels, you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, we know that Matthew, also known as Levi, was an eyewitness to Jesus' life and resurrection. We also know that John was. Mark, we know, received his information from Peter, who was one of Jesus' closest followers. Luke, we're not really sure if he received his information from an eyewitness or someone who knew an eyewitness. But this is strong evidence. We also have the writings of Paul. I want to talk particularly about 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And Paul's writings are widely accepted by scholars. In fact, it's almost universal that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians as well as other books that he wrote in the New Testament. But in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, after his death, Jesus appeared to Peter, he appeared to James, he appeared to the 12, he appeared to all the apostles. It says that he appeared to over 500 at the same time, and Paul even goes on to say, many of whom are still alive to this day, as if to say, hey, go check this out for yourself. These are all individuals who were either close followers of Jesus, eyewitnesses to his life and to his resurrection. You have Paul and James, who were converts to Christianity after Jesus rose from the dead. So this is pretty strong evidence. Number two is they had no motive to lie. Motive is really important in criminal law. It answers the question, why would someone do such a thing? Well, we know that writers of the New Testament were devout Jews. They were the chosen people, right? They believed this. So what motive would they have to invent a gospel and specifically a resurrection story? Especially knowing that by believing these things and proclaiming these things, they would be ostracized from their community. They would be beaten. Some of them gave their lives for this. So it really doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I mean, why would they do such a thing? Number three, and I like to call this the no one does this factor. All of us can probably think of a time when we either embellished a story or told a lie to make ourselves look good. I'm in the recruiting business, so I've seen this from time to time. You know, someone embellishes their resume or flat out falsifies their resume in an attempt to get a job. The truth is, people will lie to make themselves look good. But what about the person that tells a lie to make themselves look bad? Well, if you're scratching your head, you should be, because nobody does this. Historians call this the principle of embarrassment. It's one of the tests that historians use to determine whether a writing is authentic or not. And it goes something like this. It's very unlikely that someone trying to report a true event will invent details that make them look foolish. It just doesn't happen. But if someone is trying to report a true event, they'll usually give the good, the bad, and the ugly, even the embarrassing details, if they're just trying to report the event and the happenings surrounding the event. We have so many examples of this in the New Testament. For instance, some of Jesus's female followers went to the tomb that morning with some spices, and when they got there, they found that the tomb was empty. So they went back, they told the disciples, and the disciples didn't believe them. In fact, the disciples thought it was nonsense. In fact, it's recorded that they thought it was an idle tale. So why would you make up a detail like that and say that you didn't originally believe the story if you were trying to get everyone to believe the story? That doesn't make a lot of sense, and in fact, it would be embarrassing. Furthermore, we know that in the first century, a woman's testimony was not admissible in a court of law. So think about this. The resurrection is the most important detail in the whole story of the gospel. So why would the New Testament writers report that it was women that first found the empty tomb when they knew that that would not be credible testimony? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe it was because they were just telling it like it is. Okay, so number 4 is early writings, and I'm going to talk a lot more in detail about this next week in my next video. But historians will always look at the earliest, most primitive documents as the most reliable documents. And they'll ask themselves the question, do we have multiple independently attested early sources? And the answer to that, as it relates to the life of Jesus and the resurrection, is yes, we do have that. We have this in the Gospels. They are the earliest, most primitive sources for the life of Jesus. Mark, for instance, is believed to be written around 60 AD, but the pre-Markan Passion story that we have, scholars believe, and it's accepted, that that story goes back to about 40 AD, which is just a decade after Jesus died. Most of the documents that we have were written before 70 AD, but the oral traditions and the creeds contained within those documents, scholars believe, go back to just 2 to 3 years from the death of Jesus. So the idea that we don't have early writings is simply not true. And it's not really logical to say that just because later in history the early church kind of collected these documents and bound them in a book we call the New Testament, that somehow discounts them or discounts their historical value. That's just simply not true. All right, guys, that's all I have time for today. I would love it if you would subscribe or like or give me some feedback, comment on this video. I really want to know what your thoughts are. And let's keep the conversation going. Next week, I'm going to go into a lot more detail about the historical value of the early documents that we have. But until then, have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.